Go ahead, Leslie.
Okay, are we opening? Actually, I believe, first of all, I want to, Leslie Orloff, I would like to welcome you here. I'm with the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, and I'm going to turn the opening over to Detective Shelley Sonnenberg.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending the best practices to support immigrant victims and increase participation in criminal justice system. As Leslie said, I'm Detective Shelley Sonnenberg. I live here in Boise, Idaho, and have been with the Boise Police Department for about 22 years. Started working with refugee and immigrant women specifically on a one-on-one basis in 2006, where our area started receiving a large influx of new Americans coming to the area from all over the world. So we've got some things to share, give some background. Boise PD is about 300 officers. So those of you from the rural communities and then even the bigger communities, and probably right there in between. And I'll turn it over and have Bob talk a little bit about him.
Morning, I'm Bob Frechette. I'm a detective with the Rochester, New Hampshire Police Department. I've been with the department for 21 years. I spent the last 15 or so specializing in gender-based violence, specifically domestic violence, sexual assault. I do some work in human trafficking, as well as elder abuse and stalking cases. As you can imagine, there's a lot of overlap there. We don't have a whole lot of immigrant people coming forward looking for specialty type of services. So we have a lot more digging to do to actually find those folks and to connect with them and create inroads in those communities, which has been a challenge on a lot of levels. So my experience is different than Shelley's in that respect. And hopefully I can offer some of my experience to you folks as well. And our department's only about 65 sworn personnel, so we're pretty small. Our county's only about 120,000, so certainly can relate to a lot of the rural folks out there.
And my name is, as I said, Leslie Orloff. I am an attorney and do specialize in issues around immigrant survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Was involved in actually leading the efforts in Washington to draft the U visa, the T visa, the VAWA self-petition. And so for me, these trainings are super important because, you know, all of that work with writing legislation and doing work with the Department of Homeland Security to get it implemented, it's the work that you guys do in your communities that make those laws, essentially take them off the paper and make them come alive in the lives of the victims that they were hoping to serve. So I wanted to welcome you here, and I'm really happy that you've joined us today, and hope we can provide you information that will be useful to support your work. Next slide, please. Thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about NewApp. We provide training and technical assistance nationally and run a resource library. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, and we run a resource library that you can turn to get materials. And that we do training, we do social science research, legal research, and public policy work. So I welcome you here. I'm going to turn it back to Bob.
Okay, so it's poll time. So just type off into the chat box what your discipline is. So just law enforcement, prosecution, system-based advocate, community-based victim service, or an attorney. So I anticipate that we have a lot of varied folks here, and we're going to lean on you for some feedback. We want this to be interactive, and we want you to get out of it what you feel you need to. So hopefully we can work with that. I'm seeing a lot of community-based advocates, some system-based victim service, some police departments, excellent.
Great. Next slide.
And so just to kind of go through our learning objectives, we want you to have a better understanding of the U visa program. Who qualifies for it? How can that program actually start to help build trust between our immigrant crime victims, law enforcement, prosecutors? Really, the better relationships we have with these communities, the better our prosecution is going to be. The better our prosecution is, we are holding offenders accountable, we're keeping victims safe. And that's really the goal, right? So this is another tool that we have in our toolbox to work toward that end goal. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, so, whoops. Women, men, and children can qualify for those U visas. So that's an important thing to understand. And when we start to look at victim survivors of our violent crimes, those are the ones that we're really looking to target for U visas in these types of cases. You know, even some of the misdemeanor cases in context, really, we all know there's high lethality there. We look at our lethality screens. We do Dr. Campbell's tool with them. We use some of the other tools that are out there. So really understanding that, again, this is a tool. We're going to typically throughout this presentation refer to female victims of domestic violence and sexual assault because statistically that's really the case, right? When we start to look at those types of crimes, and then when we look at the U visa applications that are actually filed, we're looking at primarily female victims, but certainly, again, there are men that do qualify, and we do also have children that qualify. Go on to the next slide.
So we're going to start off. This is we call it the Shield, that was developed by the Department of Homeland Security. You will have it in your materials. Gwen, maybe you can put the link to the material. Oh, you already did. There's a link to the materials page. And if you go to that link, there's lots of materials, including this document. And this document is live, I guess you could say, full of links. If you click on the word U visa, it will take you to the Department of Homeland Security's page on U visas. If you click on the black circles, it'll take you to the most up-to-date version of the forms currently being used in that particular sector or for that particular issue. But I also want to use this slide because I want to highlight that you're going to be encountering immigrant victims who qualify for many of these forms of immigration relief. Today, we're going to be talking about the U visa explicitly, but you may encounter someone whose abuser is their U.S. citizen or lawful. If you can put yourself, you can put yourself on mute, or
I'm just saying. Apparently, it's a new excuse.
Gwen, can you mute everybody? Okay, there we go.
Yes.
Thank you. So if where was I? Yeah, so you may encounter people whose abusers are their U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, spouse or parent or step parent. Or in elder abuse cases, you may encounter people whose abusers are their adult citizen children over the age of 21. Those are people who qualify for something called the Violence Against Women Act self-petition. It is a process that moves more swiftly than the U visa. They gain access to housing and work authorization faster than U visa cases. And we have a whole webinar on the U visa that Gwen will put for you as a link, and we'll send you afterwards as a link to a webinar that you can just see the U visa and VAWA self-petition and materials related to the VAWA self-petition. In addition, there was a question, and I appreciate all the questions you asked in advance, on the battered spouse waiver. Basically, what happens, what is the relief available for victims whose citizen spouse sponsors them? And we're going to be doing a big national webinar with all the resources on battered spouse waiver on August 25th. And we will be sending you, because you signed up for this webinar, we'll be sending you an announcement with the materials after this webinar for that one as well. So that one's coming in August. You also may encounter victims, many of you will work with U visa victims whose children were also abused by, let's say it's a domestic violence case, and the husband abused both the spouse and the child. Anytime you're working with children who were abused by one or both of their parents anywhere in the world, they could qualify for special immigrant juvenile status. And following the webinar, we'll also send you a link that includes materials in case you encounter, because you will have U visa clients whose children also qualify. They'll be included in the U visa case, but they'll also qualify for special immigrant juvenile status. And then finally, you may encounter victims of human trafficking who qualify for continued presence and the T visa. And that's also very important because trafficking victims are included in the U visa, but have more access to benefits and services if they go through the T visa process. And again, we have webinars and other materials that we'll send you after the training that'll link you to more materials on T visa, but we're going to focus today on U visas. Next slide, please. So what countries are you seeing? If you could type in the chat, what countries are you seeing people that you serve coming from? What countries of origin? If you could just type some examples in the chat, that would be great. Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Yemen, Mexico, Guatemala, Bangladesh, Guyana, Honduras, China. This is great. Okay. Haiti, Jamaica. I did this in another state yesterday where everybody said Mexico, Mexico, Mexico. So in New York, it's much more diverse, and that is absolutely true. Next slide, please. Thank you. So basically, over 22% of New York's population are foreign-born, of which almost 60% are naturalized citizens, another 28% are lawful permanent residents. And then the category that we are most concerned about here today are the 12.6% who, assuming that math is right, I think it is probably, who are either undocumented immigrants or people here on some kind of a temporary visa. So work visa holders, student visa holders will all qualify for the U visa program because it helps both undocumented immigrants and non-citizens, any other immigrant who's a non-citizen or not a lawful permanent resident already. Interestingly and importantly, 36.3% of the children in New York under the age of 18 have one or more immigrant parents, and of children who live in families with at least one immigrant parent, 6.8% in New York are US citizens. Next slide, please. And that, as you indicated, when I asked you the question originally, you have a broad diversity in New York of where your foreign-born population comes from. So about 48% are from Latin America, 30% are from Asia, 3% are from the Middle East, 15% are from Europe, and then almost 5% are from Africa. So you have a broad diversity, and then you have a not insignificant percent of Canadians. It looks small compared to everyone else, but it's important because there will be people like myself who live in families that are immigrant families who speak English like I do, and you might presume don't have an immigrant background. So it's important to be open to the fact that that there will be people from foreign-born people from all over the world that you could be seeing. Now, also important in New York is 45.3% of the foreign-born persons that you're going to be working with are going to be limited English proficient, meaning they speak English less than very well. Next slide, please. So looking at 2019 data, the languages, first I will show you the languages spoken at home in New York. So you see you've got Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Arabic, French, all spoken by very significant numbers of families in New York. But then when the next slide is important because when we look at it, we're also talking about who is limited English proficient. Next slide, there we go. And so among non-citizens, 56.8% are limited English proficient in New York. And that limited English proficiency, you'll see when you look at the rates of limited English proficiency among the immigrant populations, these are slightly out of order. They're supposed to be the biggest to the smallest. We'll fix those in the future. The highest rate of limited English proficiency is not among Spanish speakers in New York. It's among Chinese speakers and Vietnamese speakers and Russian speakers and people who speak Thai and Laotian. So it's important to understand, who is LEP and be ready to respond to each of these populations. Over to you, Shelley.
Okay. So why do we have immigrant relief available to crime victims? If you guys can give me some of your ideas as to why we even have this, just put some information in the chat box and we'll talk specifically about why this relief even came about. And I'll just put it out there right now. I've heard this over and over again while I've been training all over. Well, some of these people, they're not here. They shouldn't be here. They are undocumented. And the way that I look at this particular slide is, regardless of why or how you ended up in the United States, nobody has a right to be victimized, or nobody deserves to be victimized, and nobody has the right to victimize somebody. So with these immigration relief options where we can offer some safety, I guess would be the best way to put it, to these victims, I think that it just makes America what America is. You look at some of the other countries around the world and they might not offer these things because somebody's not a citizen. And I love the way we attack this issue and allow them to have the human rights that everybody deserves. So the encouraging reporting crime is super important. Let's go to the next slide and talk about it. You guys are hitting this right on, exactly what I was looking for. So our goal is ultimately to get the crimes that are occurring to law enforcement so we know what's going on in our community. That's going to keep the community safe, the police officers safe, the victims safe. If we don't know what's going on, how can we fix it, right? As law enforcement officers, my job, Bob's job, is to put the bad guy away. If we don't have the ability to do that because we don't have any information coming in that somebody's being victimized, then we're kind of failing at our job. So it's going to open up that community policing concept. And I believe what I have seen is once you offer this and people see that we're trying to help others, they tell people about that. They tell people in their community, and we get more and more people coming forward, not quite as fearful to report, and we get a better understanding of what's going on in our community. By doing that, we have the victims staying with us longer, and we actually get down the road through prosecution and sentencing, and we're winning because our bad guy's going to jail. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the immigrants and how, how they are uniquely affected by domestic and sexual violence. So take a look at this one. Their options, they're uniquely, I'm sorry here. So they're uniquely affected because of which of the following, and go ahead and put that in the chat box there. I mean, is it the US Constitution doesn't protect them? Resources to help victims are only available to those who speak English. State law does not require police to help immigrant crime victims. I'm assuming most of us are going to realize, yeah, and recognize that it's the, I mean, this is so true in any situation, but offenders prey on those that they think they can get away with it. So the fears, misconceptions, the barriers, Leslie already commented on this earlier, but the lack of ability to speak English and communicate with law enforcement becomes a huge issue. That those language barriers, luckily we have things in place that tell law enforcement officers, if you don't understand the words coming out of someone's mouth, you need to find an interpreter who can. So through the Department of Justice and Title VI, we are required to provide equal and fair service. And the only way to do that is by using an interpreter to find out what the crime was and what occurred coming from the victim and the suspect. So, and I think most importantly is they manipulate the legal system. It's all about power and control, and we know that specifically in domestic and sexual violence.
So the yeah, great, thank you. And the legislative intent for Congress is they wanted to do two things simultaneously. The Violence Against Women Act, when it was written, and it's important to understand that all of the immigration relief in the Violence Against Women Act continues in place and is not affected by any delays in reauthorization. So these are in place from the time that they pass as part of VAWA, and VAWA's immigration provisions have continued to improve through VAWA 94, 2000, 2005, and 2013. But what Congress wanted is for victims to be able to come forward, as Detective Sonnenberg said, and report crimes to police. They wanted to improve community policing, which helps everyone, and they wanted to remove immigration status as a barrier, as a tool that perpetrators could use to silence victims. And they wanted to offer security and safety and protection and a path to, rebuilding their lives and becoming part of our society and being actively involved in our communities to immigrant survivors. Next slide, please. And that one of the things that immigration Congress was concerned about was how that we presented to Congress back when they wrote the original Violence Against Women Act, and since then, of data that shows how perpetrators of violence against immigrant women and children in particular use immigration-related abuse as a power and control tool. And they'll refuse to file papers, promise to file papers, withdraw papers that they've filed, threatened and actually attempt to make calls to the Department of Homeland Security to turn victims in, force victims to work out with false documents, and use all of this as a way to keep control over keep the victim from leaving an abusive relationship or abusive workplace, reporting to officials about the abuse and cooperating in criminal investigations and prosecutions. Next slide, please. And that our social science research has shown us that once victims file VAWA self-petitions and U visas, 25% of perpetrators are actively involved in trying to get victims reported and removed from the United States. In addition, when we're talking about this kind of a training and we're talking about law enforcement, 36% of perpetrators, largely because of language access issues at crime scenes, are effective in getting victims who call the police for help arrested at the scene as the perpetrator. And so that's why language access is so important. And that's why the training that we're doing today is important, to be aware of U visa as a tool. And that the other thing that we found is U visa applicants and VAWA self-petitioners have much higher future reporting rates than other foreign-born persons. The fact that they come forward and get help with the U visa and the VAWA self-petition, and they get the kinds of support that all of you offer these victims really makes a difference in terms of crime reporting in the future. And in fact, our latest data has shown that not only do they report future crimes, but that 22% of victims, once they get U visa and VAWA self-petitioners, that once they get work authorization and deferred protection from deportation themselves, 22% of them reach out and help other victims get help from the justice system in the future. And so it's really important to understand that this immigration-related abuse and these threats of deportation, the attempts to get victims deported, don't exist in a vacuum, that they co-occur and coexist with physical and sexual abuse, and often predict that if you have these kinds of immigration-related abuse in a case you're working on, or you see it or learn about it, this is a case where either it corroborates the physical or sexual abuse, or it predicts that the violence in this relationship is escalating. So it's really important to document, and really important to document the not only the physical and sexual abuse, but the immigration-related threats as well. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so let's, this is another interactive session. So let's talk about what prevents immigrant victims from reporting crimes and or participating in investigations and prosecutions. Let me know your thoughts on why this occurs. And fear, I have, first one came up immediately, fear of deportation, just overall fear. I think there's fear of law enforcement just coming forward. We've got fear of removal, fear of violence, especially retaliation. Yeah, I mean, this is the section that I really enjoy teaching because I think it makes us delve into the psyche of the victim, specifically those of the immigrant and refugee communities, and even more so of those who have limited English proficiency. So let's talk about those things. We've got fear. I think we have some misconceptions, and I think that we have barriers that exist when we're dealing with the immigrant and refugee communities. So let's talk specifically about the fears first. You guys brought up a lot of these already. I mean, I think that the deportation is the biggest one, and I think it's the one that the perpetrators use most often, and kind of use that to continue to take advantage of the victim and continue to victimize them. So for some of the community members that I work with, I mean, the circumstances in their home country, some of them can't go home because they have refugee status. Others are fearful to go home. We don't know why they came here. They could have been running for their lives. And then look at these things that are still what we deal with domestic and sexual assault victims all the time. The separation from children, the lack of family contact, the dangers, the retaliation, the ostracism in the community. I deal with specifically with the refugee communities that are here in the Boise area because they need each other. There's only a small community that's here, and they rely on each other. So coming forward and reporting can really cause fear in those communities. When it comes to the misconceptions, a lot of them in their home countries, I mean, regardless, even the countries you guys mentioned, I mean, what was law enforcement like there? They don't even have the civil rights that we do here, or at least they're not protected. I've had so many people tell me that in their home country, it's okay to hit your spouse. That's the only way that person can keep you in line. And then they come to the US and, we have all these laws that protect them and they don't even know that they exist. We talked about the lack of the trust in police. who knows what the perpetrator is telling them? You know, not only that, you know, they'll be arrested, but they'll be deported. I mean, all these things that are being told to them, there's no way for them to know any better. And so they continue to be victimized because of the information they're receiving. Like I said, most likely through the perpetrator. And then the biggest thing that we're dealing with, go ahead.
Yeah, so Shelley, well, go ahead and do the barriers and then I'll jump in. Sorry.
Okay. So we talk about the LEP individuals, of them coming forward and not being able to speak English. Do they even know where to go, first of all, let alone believe that an officer is going to take the time to call an interpreter so they can actually report the crime that they want to? These are things that we as a community need to get the information out there to let them know, yes, we are here to support you and we will provide an interpreter so we know what's going on in your life. The financial dependency of the suspect, the community pressure, family pressure, religious pressures, all of this is what we deal with, like I said, regardless of whether or not the person's LEP or not. But just add that extra issue on, and it's really difficult for our victims to come forward and report the crimes. Go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah, so Shelley, a question that people were asking in advance is, as a police officer, do you ask about immigration status? How do you address that issue? Or how do you kind of figure out who might be foreign born?
So I'm sure that each agency is different. Ours, it's actually written in the policy. That is not a question we ask, nor do we want to ask. It does come to light sometimes when, you know, a U visa is filed and we find out, you know, where their immigration status is, but that is not something that the officers responding even address, not only per policy, but just per human rights. Doesn't matter whether or not somebody is documented or undocumented here. If they don't have a visa, I mean, if they're a victim of a crime, that needs to be the number one issue that we're addressing. So at least here in Boise, that does not even come up. Bob, I don't know how it is in Rochester, but maybe jump in and offer a little bit on that too, because it's a big problem. I know people are concerned about it.
And absolutely, people are concerned about it, and we're in the same boat. We do not ask that as a routine question. I'd be very surprised to see that come across the lips of any of our officers. The only time that it shows up is if we run somebody. Oftentimes, dispatch will run the parties when our officers are responding out to a call, and if they come up with some sort of an immigration hit, they might look into that later on, but they're going out to deal with the crime that they were called for. They're going out to keep people safe. And if there's somebody that's posing a threat, somebody that's creating fear, then we're going to address that. We're going to deal with that person appropriately. We're going to connect the victim with services. We're going to, if the line officer isn't familiar with the immigration services, they're going to reach out to somebody like me, or they're going to rely on our crisis center advocates to help connect that person with services, or here at our Family Justice Center, which is where I work out of. So there's a lot of different options, and our line officers do know that and do not routinely ask anything related to immigration status. Again, it's the only time it ever comes up is if there's an NCIC hit, so a national computer hit. So
and that's pretty typical nationally. What you'll see is that it's often the systems-based victim advocates that first kind of figure out that somebody may be undocumented, or it's a partner agency that is a victim services agency that might be doing that kind of a screening. So it's not the officer themselves. And that's why having those partnerships set up in advance is really important. And also, for those of you that work in prosecutor's office, and we have a whole set of prosecutors tools that we can send you as well. From a prosecutor's perspective, the fact that the victim, when she called 911 or didn't know that there was a U visa is a good thing. And it means, and that she later learned about it because of a victim advocate. It means when the defense counsel tries to raise the immigration status of the victim, let's say in the prosecution, you can bring in prior consistent statements that show that she called the police, she spoke to investigators, she did an identification, all before she ever even knew there was a U visa. And so that helps. The other thing I want to mention just here before we shift, Shelley, back to you, is that one of the questions had to do with what kinds of services undocumented victims can get. And there's a whole range of services that are available to everybody without regard to immigration status. And we have lots of materials on this that we can send as part of a follow-up to this training, including some webinars and other things. But undocumented victims have access to shelter, transitional housing, crisis centers, family justice centers, courts, protection orders. They can pay taxes using an ITIN number. They can get a special number that allows them to pay taxes even though they don't have a social security number. And they get a full range of services that are necessary to protect life and safety, help from food banks and things like that. And in this, the next webinar that we're going to do with you, that's going to be sponsored by the same host as this webinar, will delve into the details of all of that. Back to you, Shelley.
Okay. Hey, in one of the responses, Yasmin says the police are corrupt. That was not a misconception. Maybe in their home country. I mean, I'm hoping that people, you wouldn't be on this webinar, I don't think, but I'm hoping here in the US that we are trying to break down those barriers and offering the support and the needed resources that the victims need, regardless of their immigration status. So let's just take a look at this all together. The misconceptions, fears, and barriers in the next slide. And then you add in immigration status and then the lack of language access. I mean, as you can see, it's just kind of a downhill spiral. And it means that from a law enforcement standpoint and an advocate standpoint, that we just have a lot of work to do. Education is key here. I really am an advocate for making sure that everyone knows how and when to obtain an interpreter, and we've got a lot of training that's available. I think we have a webinar coming up here soon, and all that stuff at the end of this webinar, we will make sure that we provide those training opportunities for you guys as we wrap this one up. But please consider equal and fair service for everyone, including those that don't speak English. Make sure you have the ability to communicate with them.
All right, so here's another poll question. How many cases have you had involving a U visa? And as you're putting in those responses, this is an area that I can relate to if you're one of those agencies that's saying, hey, I haven't had that many, maybe I've had none. In the 5 years that my current chief has been in office, not a single one has come across his desk. Not a single U visa application or certification has come across his desk. The reason I know that is because he didn't really know what to do with these things, and they're coming to me. So it's really interesting that we do have an immigrant population in my area, but we aren't seeing these. So if you're in one of those rural communities, or even if you're in a bigger community and you're saying, geez, I'm not seeing that many of these things come in, why is that? What are we doing? What can we do better? Do people not need this tool in your area, or are they just not aware of it? And how can we increase that awareness? So it looks like the responses are pretty all over the place. So we've got a few I don't knows. We've got quite a few more than 25. I'm assuming those are probably in the more urban areas, and then we have quite a few with fewer than 5 as well. So so again, all over the place here. So good diverse audience. So we'll go on to the next slide.
I'm calling the.
Yeah, okay, great.
Sometimes we think we're on mute. We don't know. So let's talk about the U visas at a basic level. I agree. I think it depends. Sometimes we go through years where we do, 20, 25, even here in Boise, and then there's years that we do 10. I don't know if that's an education thing. I mean, I hope that we're doing a better job of it. A lot of times, I think just depending on the location where a lot of the immigrants are living. So in some of the rural country or counties, I can see where you would be doing more than 25. Maybe there's a larger population there. But I think for us, all of us that are on this call, it's important to know that we are a resource for them, even if it's just letting them know that it's out there. So when we talk about U visas, and ultimately what we're doing is going through a process that might provide them a temporary stay for up to 4 years. That's good for law enforcement because it gives us an opportunity to complete the case, prosecute it, sentence it, and having the victim here and not having them deported, which obviously is immediately what the perpetrator wants to occur, is to get them deported so they can't testify against them. There are only 10,000 that are issued or granted per year. The process is a long one. There's a lot of backlog, I will tell you that. The application actually requires certification from a designated government official. So, and Leslie will speak more to this, but police departments, prosecutors' offices, judges, I mean, there's a lot of options for them to reach out and ask for the certification to be signed. And it's really important for people to understand the certification is only one part of the whole process. I mean, the victim is responsible for submitting it in the end, but I hear this all the time from law enforcement officers that they feel like they're vouching for the victim and they don't even know them. That is not the case. We're going to talk about specifically what is required. The next slide talks a little bit about the eligibility and what a U visa, what is needed for a U visa. And in this situation, a victim needs to be, they need to be a victim of a qualifying criminal activity, and we're going to go through what those are. They have to possess information about the crime, which seems pretty obvious, but these are the stipulations that have been put in place. And the criminal activity has to have occurred in the U.S. Or violates a U.S. law. The only caveat to that is if it's, let's say, on an Air Force base over in Germany, that's still considered U.S. soil under this particular process. So the next step of that is defining whether or not the victim is helpful, has been, is being, or is likely to be helpful in the detection, investigation, prosecution, conviction, here's the important thing, or sentencing. So at any time, if that victim has come forward and helped, they are eligible for the U visa. And then they have to have suffered, in this case, like some type of physical or mental abuse. And that will be, you'll understand that a little bit more when we talk about the qualifying criminal activities. Next slide, please. So I don't think this is probably surprising, which is unfortunate, but what we have found is the majority of these, almost half of the U visas that are requested come from a domestic violence situation. Again, under the circumstances of why they're here and the immigrant status of most of our victims, they can be taken advantage of pretty easily. 30% is going to be rape, sexual assault, human trafficking, incest. And as you see, we've got, as it goes down, there's additional ones, but it's a smaller percentage than those first two. I mean, that's 75% are pretty horrid crimes being committed against the immigrant communities. Next slide.
So we're talking now about the U visa timeline, and essentially what's really important, next slide please, to understand is that, and this is now like very recently changed. So I want to walk you through what this means. So the blue boxes are the multiple points, and now there's one more that would go on this list, in time where the Department of Homeland Security is running and checking the fingerprints of the applicant. So they're looking to see the criminal, and if there is a criminal history when they apply, but throughout the process, they're going to be checking the criminal history of the applicant and determining whether whatever history they have in their discretion should be waived. So there are fraud checks throughout the process. But in addition, so the question is, when do victims start getting protection? And what happens is when they file the VAWA self-petition, when they file the U visa, they get so they get a certification, they file, and they can't file until they get the certification. So they get the certification and they file, and then they get what's called VAWA confidentiality protection. And that protection gives them, it cuts off the ability of the Department of Homeland Security to rely on perpetrator provided tips to harm the victim. So it gives them some initial protection against deportation. And can you silence everybody, Gwen? Okay. And under a new process that has just been initiated by the Department of Homeland Security, once the victim files, they will then, their first step in the adjudication process will be to screen the case for a bona fide determination to see if the evidence looks valid, if they've submitted evidence on all the required points, and to run a background check, run a fingerprint check. And if the person looks like they filed a valid case and has run and clears a fingerprint check, they will get a bona fide determination, which will give them much earlier access to work authorization and formal protection from deportation than they currently get. Usually they have to wait, up until recently, they've had to wait between 4 and 5 years to get that. This process should shrink those timeframes to under a year and possibly close to 6 months over time. It's unclear, but it'll be much faster than it is right now. And so the sooner that victims are identified and the sooner they receive receive certifications, they can get on this path that could get them in a much shorter period of time to work authorization and protection from deportation, which our social science data has shown us triggers a cascade of benefits for both law enforcement and victims. Trust in law enforcement, once victims get those two things, goes up 114%. The ability of victims to get a job that pays at least a minimum wage triples. They're 6 times more likely to get involved in their children's school. All kinds of benefits that we just documented in a Transforming Lives survey that we can send you that show how much their lives change at that early stage of getting work authorization and protection from deportation. So the real focus now is getting these things filed, getting certifications so that victims are within a year or so of getting that kind of protection, at which point they become better witnesses, more involved in the criminal justice system and the civil justice system, and their lives really begin to reap the benefits of the U visa program as they wait for their visas, which could take a decade and a half to get. So that there's real benefits that happen early in the process and that sustain them while they wait in line to get their visa. Next slide, please. So that what happens is that victims, when they first file their case, they get red flagged in the system so that when the perpetrators are trying to call and turn in victims, DHS can see that this is the case of a victim and the person who's calling is a perpetrator, and they don't respond. And then if they do respond, they could be sanctioned for violation of VAWA confidentiality. Next slide, please. VAWA confidentiality has three parts. It has the part I just described that prohibits the Department of Homeland Security from relying on perpetrator provided information. There's also safety, victim safety provisions in terms of there are locations where they cannot enforce immigration laws. Now, those locations have under VAWA confidentiality always included places like courthouses for victims. Now, courthouse enforcement is extremely limited and precluded, largely precluded for all immigrants with new policies that were issued in the last several months. And other protected locations included, like Bob was saying, he works at a family justice center. Family justice centers, rape crisis center, programs and places that serve victims are also prohibited locations. And finally, for the prosecutors on the call, it's important to note that there are non-disclosure provisions that essentially VAWA confidentiality prohibits immigration enforcement, prohibits discovery of the immigration case file beyond the certification of itself in criminal court cases. And we'll be providing you information and case law on that issue. Next slide, please.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at the U visa certification and specifically at the qualifying criminal activity. So the next slide is going to show you all the options that are available to the victims. Specifically, when you look at those, they're going to be very violent crimes. It's one of those things where you can look at those, and it's going to be not only the violent crimes, but you can recognize that the victims of these, why, as Bob said, a lot of them, it's going to be women and children that are the ones who are the victims of most of these. We look at this and consider a couple of things. For example, go ahead, the next slide, it's fine. The qualifying criminal activity doesn't always exactly translate to the crimes in your community. For example, felonious assault was one of them on the last page. We in Boise, Idaho don't have a felonious assault. It's not written that way. However, we do have an assault, an aggravated assault. We do have something that would be equivalent to that. So be considered when you're looking at all that list of those crimes, and that will be also provided to you, that it might not say exactly what it does in your state, in your city, but consider the totality of the situation. These are criminal activities that don't necessarily have to have been completed. It can be attempts, conspiracy, solicitation. There's a lot of things to consider when you're identifying the qualifying criminal activity. So I look at the case or the certification that you get and look at that form and look at the totality of the situation.
The U visa is available to help both direct victims, the victim of the crime themselves, and indirect victims. So for example, in a murder case, the victim that we normally think of is dead, but the victim has a spouse or a child. That spouse or child is the indirect victim of the murder or the manslaughter, is the way to think about it. And in cases where you have like a 3-year-old child or any child under the age of 21, their parent could be the indirect victim, and vice versa. A child can be an indirect victim of a parent's harm. Plus you have direct victims who, when the direct victim is incompetent, you can have an indirect victim as well that applies. There were questions we got in advance about the issue of witnesses who are not themselves victims. And I wanted to explain there's only very limited circumstances where somebody who was a bystander or a witness could benefit from the U visa. And the prime example, and this was an example that the Department of Homeland Security included in the preamble to the regulations, was a case in which this is a case in which there was a domestic violence situation in the relationship, a father who was separated from his spouse and child. The father, it was the summer, they were having a birthday party for the child on the front lawn in their house. And the father came with a gun to kill the wife and shot somebody. He didn't kill the wife, he shot somebody else. And there was a participant at the party of the child who was pregnant and miscarried as a result of being present during the shooting. So that person would qualify as an indirect victim under the U visa, but you need somebody who was physically harmed in some way as a result of being there during the victimization if they weren't the target themselves. So it's a very limited circumstance. Back to you, Shelley.
So we're going to talk specifically, since this seems to be the biggest issue when filling out the certification, is what is actually helpful. So when we're determining helpfulness, this is going to be a case-by-case basis. The agency, the certifying agency itself, is going to be the one who determines that helpfulness. Now remember, it has been, will be, or has the potential of being helpful. All of those things considered, at what point do we look at the certification? I'm with Leslie. I think certify early. Let's make sure that we keep this victim here, because guess what? If she or he knows that they aren't going to be deported, how willing are they going to be continue to be helpful to us? The degree of helpfulness required and is determined totally by the circumstance itself. I think this is the toughest one for law enforcement officers is, you know, let's say the person called, they gave you the initial report, and then all of a sudden they quit talking to you. But do we know about the crime? Which again, can we now pursue charges against the suspect? That person, to me, was helpful in the very beginning because we didn't even know that a crime was occurring. So just consider each case is going to be different. The agency can complete it, and then as time goes on, if they feel like the person hasn't has gotten to a point where they weren't as helpful as they thought, they can include information in the certification saying that they were helpful, but then they quit being helpful. All of that can be documented. Even after you send it in and they quit being helpful, you can call Homeland Security and explain that to them. But let's keep them here as long as we can, because just because somebody says, no, I don't want to talk to you anymore, doesn't mean in 2 months they're not going to be willing to talk to you again. And our job is to get that case prosecuted. So the next slide is probably the easiest to explain this. Has been, is being, or is likely to be helpful in any of those things. The detection is the number one thing. If we are even looking at a U visa certification form, we know about a crime. So consider that when you're evaluating the form, excuse me, and trying to determine the helpfulness of the victim. Next slide, please. So again, we're trying to look at this from a victim-centered approach. This is, again, difficult for law enforcement, I'll just tell you. I mean, even when I started in this work, I mean, this is a stumbling block for me, is I wanted that case to be completed to fruition to the point where I knew that my bad guy was in jail. Consider that these things are not always needed in order to be a victim to be helpful. We won't go through all of them, but sometimes the offender isn't even identified. We've had robbery situations where the suspect was never identified, obviously never prosecuted, but that victim still experienced one of those qualifying crimes. Just consider that knowing about it, I guess, and I'm going to repeat that probably several more times, just knowing about the crime is enough for that person to have been helpful. And consider that when you get that form in front of you. Let's go to the next slide here. So I can give some examples of what that looks like. It's as easy as calling 911 to testifying at the bond hearing, trial, sentencing. I mean, it really runs the gamut. All of those things in my book that we're looking at right here, that person has been helpful. And at any point, just like all of our victims of domestic battery and sexual assault, there may be a time that they quit being as helpful as they were in the beginning. But we deal with that with people that are citizens here in the US. So consider where the immigrant victim is coming from. We have a lot of outside play in what's going on in their world. So consider all of the examples, and it's up to you, it's up to the agency that's certifying it to determine that. But I always lean on the side of, I know about a crime, so let's move forward. Next slide.
So as Shelley talked about a little earlier, there's a lot of different agencies who can certify. When we wrote the statute, we designed it this way because we knew that there would be victims who would walk through different doors. And when we talk about limited English proficient victims, it may be that the courthouse could be the first place where they actually get a qualified interpreter. It shouldn't be, but it could be. And so that's why, nationally, when you look, police, prosecutors, and judges are the biggest group of certifiers. And it's important to note that judges can certify not only in criminal cases, but in protection order cases, custody cases, child welfare cases, where they detect any of the criminal activities. The departments of labor at the state and federal levels can certify, as can child and elder abuse agencies. There's no statute limitations on when the crime had to have occurred. It could have been 20 years ago, it could have been yesterday, in terms of certification. But there's a 6-month window. Once a victim gets a certification, they must file their U visa case within 6 months, which is why sometimes, particularly during the pandemic, there's been a longer delay and somebody might need to come back for recertification. Over to you, Bob.
Okay, I feel like the quiz master today because I got a lot of the polls here. So here's another poll. If you fall under that list that we just had up there as to who can certify, when do you certify? And if you don't fall under that list, when do you think? So let's throw those answers into the chat. When do we certify these things? So there's a few different options here, obviously. And I think, we talk about conviction of the defendant. I feel like we can just rule that one right out, right? I mean, we have non-immigrant cases where there are cooperative, for lack of a better term, victims who give us a ton of information, and we go forward with trial, and for whatever reason, the jury or the judge doesn't find that victim or the corroborating evidence useful. So we get a not guilty there. So that's a one to easy get rid of there. So I'm seeing a lot of immediately upon receipt of certification. So if we get that right away and we certify it, have we done our job at this point? And I think that is a nice idea, that we get the thing in and we automatically certify it, but we also have to know, is the victim helpful, right? Because we have to certify their helpfulness here. So I think our better answer might be B, right? So we have to determine that helpfulness or believes the victim is likely to be helpful. And as Shelley said, that helpful metric is, that bar is pretty low. We just need, that 911 call, somebody was calling for help. We know that just getting that offender on our radar is helpful, right? We know that if we just, the protective factors, some of the research that's out there about protective factors, if we arrest a perpetrator of domestic violence, that's a threefold protective factor for victims, even if we don't have successful prosecution. So we want to, want to have that low threshold, but we can't just, oh, there's a U visa application, let's just sign off on it and send it off. We need to do a little bit more than that, but we certify early. We get it out there, we get it done so that we can keep that victim on board. Because really, what keeps the victim on board? Meeting their needs. That's why the concept of family justice centers exist, right? So that's, I think, where we should land on that one. So we'll give it back to Shelley now.
Okay, so when we're analyzing those requests, I mean, and Nina, I think that we answered your question there, but I mean, it really is whether you certify and determine helpfulness, it is ultimately determined by the agency that's making, who's signing the form. So was the criminal activity a qualifying crime? Identify the victim, determine helpfulness. I mean, it's really, it isn't that involved. It seems like it, but it isn't that involved. We move on to the process for us. You analyze the request, and then this is kind of what the U visa certification process looks like from a law enforcement standpoint or the certifying agency.
Next slide, please.
So you look here, and I won't go through everything. I think the most important thing is looking at that big blue box there on the right. It's honestly as simple as that, and yet this training seems to really stump those certifying agencies. Again, there is such a large gap between what we do and the final outcome. These forms are being looked at over and over and over again. The USCIS is the one who ultimately determines, but this is after a background check. This is after they've gone through the entire form and all of the connecting information that's provided by the victim. I don't want any of you to think that, oh, I've agreed to allow this person to stay and I don't have any knowledge of who this person is. That is determined. That is determined not by you. You're just saying these three things. There was criminal activity that justifies a U visa. It occurred in the US. The victim was, is, or has been helpful and will be helpful in any of those things. Honestly, that's as easy as I can make it for you guys. Let's talk a little bit about the form, Leslie.
Sure. So the other point I wanted to make and to reiterate what Shelley just said, the certification does not confer immigration status on anyone. It opens the door. It's a required piece of paper for the application, but USCIS takes it from there. 2 slides forward, please, Rocio. So what I'm going to do very quickly is highlight some key things about the form so if people understand it. This is the demographic information. This is the part, if you're a victim advocate or an attorney, that you want to definitely fill out for and help the agency with, but it may be the only part you need to fill out. The agency can fill out the rest of the form from there. Next slide, please. Basically, you have to identify the head of the agency who can always certify, and that head of the agency can designate any supervisor as a certifier. And that if the person has been designated, whatever letter designated them should be attached to the form, and their information is here. Next slide, please. So what's really important here is that you want to fill out, the certifiers need to fill out the form with every part of every type of criminal activity detected. So for example, the police department might be really upset, or the prosecutor might be really wanting to prosecute obstruction of justice. But if it was obstruction of justice in a domestic violence and sexual assault case, they have to check off domestic violence, sexual assault, and obstruction of justice, because the victim is not going to be able to prove substantial harm from the obstruction of justice the same way they might be able to from the domestic violence or the felonious assault. So you want to check all boxes that are criminal activities in that case that you detect. For the dates on the next slide, you're going to put the dates and the statutes. You want to provide the statutory citations so DHS doesn't mistakenly look them up wrong. Next slide, please. and that you want to provide detailed information about how the victim was helpful. And although the victim has the obligation of proving substantial harm, if you have photographs or evidence of physical injury or things that were observed, that kind of information is super helpful to the victim. Next slide, please. So then they're going to ask you whether the victim had the information, whether they've been helpful, and whether since the cooperation, since they started working with you, since they first called 911, whether they'd continued to be helpful. And as Shelley talked about earlier, there'll be times where the victim might be more helpful and less helpful. We do know from social science data that these victims over time, particularly once they get work authorization and deferred action, get more and more helpful, although they may have times where they are not as helpful. And if their lack of helpfulness was not unreasonable, you can still and should still sign the form. Next slide, please. And that the form asks you to provide information about who's the culpable person, in case it's a family member in particular, they want that information from you. And on the last slide, you're further certifying that if the victim unreasonably refuses to assist in investigation or prosecution in the future, you'll let USCIS know. Next slide, please. Back to you.
All
Bob.
right, so another poll, raise your hand. I mean, this is kind of, I think, a rhetorical question for anybody who's been around a little bit. We have victims of these types of crimes come on and off our radar all the time. So, I mean, just type into the chat if you've never had somebody who became uncooperative with the system in some way, shape, or form. And I think that that this is the norm, right? The day of, why is the 911 call being made? The 911 call is being made because I want the violence to stop. I don't feel safe. I need somebody to help me, right? And so then we go from there to, oh my goodness, there's consequences. All of the things the abuser has been telling me all along are now potentially reality. I'm going to lose my kids. I'm going to be deported. I'm going to fill in the blank. Whatever's going to happen, I can't make the bills. All of these barriers to all victims, and then you add in the immigration piece of it that makes it even more complicated. So this idea of they have to stay on board from the get-go through the trial is not reality in any situation. And we go to the next slide.
So there are, the way I like to think about this is there are two distinct requirements. There's the helpfulness requirement, which is what's needed for certification. Did they call 911? Did they seek a protection order? Did they provide information to the police, allow photographs to be taken? There's all of that very basic. Did they provide tips, clues, information to law enforcement or prosecutors? That in the detection, investigation, prosecution, conviction, or sentencing, and you're noticing these are all ors. After they file the U visa case, there's another requirement, which is that they provide ongoing cooperation that has to be reasonably requested by law enforcement, but the victim may show that their refusal to cooperate was not unreasonable to both law enforcement and USCIS. They can show that. Next slide, please. And so the way to think about this is, first of all, there's two pieces. Was the law enforcement's request, given the facts of this case, reasonable? And so, the request for prosecutors or law enforcement to cooperate in domestic violence and sexual assault cases, the law enforcement best practices are to recognize the trauma that the victim has suffered. And so it would be weighed as what's reasonable given the type of the case. So they're going to look at the reasonableness of the request, and that's USCIS. They're going to look at the totality of the circumstances, because it's USCIS who will decide, the Department of Homeland Security adjudicators will decide whether a victim who was helpful at one point and then less cooperative and more cooperative over time ultimately should get a U visa. And they're required to look at the totality of the circumstances, Look at the reasonable requests and whether or not the victim's refusal was unreasonable. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to steal a little bit of Bob's thunder here. We have a poll coming up, but I think it's appropriate to just offer it up here. I'm not sure from a law enforcement standpoint or a certifying agency standpoint that we're the best one to determine why the victim might be refusing. I mean, that victim knows why he or she is refusing because of whatever internal trauma is going on with them. So for us, when we look at this, does the person have a good reason for saying no? Consider all those things. Are they being intimidated? We don't know that. Is the trauma, are they having post-traumatic stress from what the experience that they had, they experienced? Is their family coming down on them? But again, as I said, regardless of the victim's immigration status, these are all things that we've seen that's happened in our DV cases and our sexual assault cases. So consider that unreasonableness and then move forward. Next slide. If you still believe after you've tried to look at this from a victim's point of view and you still believe that it's unreasonable, you can sign the certification and add those notes, as I said earlier. Then it becomes their issue, I guess, their burden to prove why they chose not to assist law enforcement anymore or the prosecutor's office. It's their opportunity to explain to DHS, and as I said before, they're the ones who make the ultimate decision on that. So next slide, and I'm sorry I kind of took away Bob's poll there, but go ahead, Bob.
All right. So we know that that victims are in the best position to know why they're going to participate or not participate with prosecution and the investigation and so on. One thing I just want to interject here, when we start to think about why might somebody not participate with prosecution, I saw representatives from Queens in the room. You folks, your DA's office is doing amazing things regarding jail calls and forfeiture by wrongdoing. Forfeiture by wrongdoing is basically just taking away the defendant's right to cross-examine their accuser. And this is because they're making the victim unavailable for trial by their wrongdoing. And jail calls are a great tool for doing that. So jail calls can help us show, hey, look at this witness tampering that's going on, this interference with the victim's attempts to seek help. Maybe it's, hey, you're getting deported now because you turned me in, but if you go in and recant, then this will all get better and you'll be safe again, right? So this can help us in that. Go ahead to the next slide. So really, when we look at our practice, what tactics are the offender using? And we know that these run the gamut. And the more we know about the community that we're working with, or the more inroads we have with that community, the more we're going to learn about those specific dynamics and what type of control could an offender use. We want to address this witness intimidation. The jail calls, as I mentioned, are gold. That's a great thing for any of you who have interns, to have them start to listen to some of these jail calls and tell them what they're listening for. Do spontaneous, for law enforcement, do these wellness checks for child protective services, elder services. We want to do these proactive checks when they're appropriate. A lot of times when somebody's arrested, there's bail conditions issued that say, hey, no contact. Even if there's not a civil domestic violence protective order issued, maybe there's bail conditions prohibiting contact. And we go out there. This is one of the things that we do on our proactive nights. And when I get a tip that, hey, this person's probably going to violate, we're going out and just randomly knocking on doors saying, hey, how's it going? Oh, you're not supposed to be here. Let me give you some new jewelry. They're called handcuffs. Right? So we can do things like that to help better understand why is somebody not participate or trying to participate with prosecution. Why can't we get a hold of them? Why is that helpfulness changed? This is all about collaboration. We need to work together. each little piece of the system does not hold the key. Again, this is the idea behind family justice centers, right? This is, we live together, we work together, we share ideas, we say, okay, our goals are the same, even though we're coming at it from a different standpoint. So work together, work with that immigration attorney that the victim has, establish those safe points of contact with friends and family. Who's going to know how to reach you if I can't reach you? You know, who's that constant person in your life that's going to always know where you're at? Because I want to check on your safety and safety planning, especially from the confidential advocacy side of the world. You guys are experts at this, and this is something that we all need to work together on to constantly safety plan with that victim. Next slide, please. And I love this quote. We never learn about successful intimidation, right? It's only that unsuccessful intimidation that we learn about when we're part of the prosecution system. The witness intimidation, the witness tampering, all of that stuff is always going on. You can go on to the next slide.
So very briefly, the concern from prosecutors' perspective has to do with the accusation that the victim is going to lie for an immigration benefit. And we have lots of, next slide, please, lots of training tools for prosecutors that walk through how to plan your case so that you're planning to either raise the immigration status issue as part of your case to show that you targeted this victim because of her immigration status and because you're going to use it to silence her, or you're going to lie in wait for that. You decided you're going to wait for the defense to raise it so that you can then introduce prior consistent statements. Next two slides, Roberto. And that prior consistent, next one, prior consistent statements allow you to bring in all the things. When she called 911, as I said earlier, she didn't know about the U visa. And you can show that timeline and bring in prior consistent statements that are not hearsay, they're not subject to Crawford, and they can rehabilitate her and show that she didn't know about any of this when she called 911 or identified the suspect, et cetera. Next slide, please. And you can see that what we have found is that you get in all the statements that happened before the quote motive to lie arose as a matter in the timeline, and that prosecutors who use this technique are very effective in having successful trials without, and despite the fact, and they can certify early, the police can certify early, and it doesn't undermine the criminal case. We have whole trainings for prosecution on this, and we have a TNU visa certification manual among our resources that we will provide you that walks prosecutors through this as well. Next slide, please. Next one. Next slide. Shelley?
So I'm just going to jump in here real quick. I think the whole purpose of this is we're asking you guys to look to the future. Like, make sure that you're ready when and if you are doing these. Implement the policies and have them available to those that might be receiving them. Specifically, you know, your officers, your detectives. Make sure that, you know, we have, especially here in Idaho, a lot of us are rural, the judges, the prosecutor's office, make sure that they know that they have the ability to sign these certifications and what goes along with that. We want to make sure that the information is getting out there. Education is huge. And then make sure that we are working together with the prosecutors when we're moving these cases forward. Next slide. As we go on here, I would like you guys just to put in the chat box any other issues that you guys have surrounding immigrant crime victims that you'd like to know about. Leslie's going to go over some of the resources that we have. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in here and we'll get that too. This is a quick overview. I mean, normally these classes are much, much longer. I mean, just let us know how we can best help you. That's why all of us do this job. Bob and I, as law enforcement officers, we want to make sure that we're providing the resources for you out there, especially if you don't have that relationship with your law enforcement agencies.
So as Yeah, and please type in anything else that we didn't address that you want to address, because we're going to be doing a part 2, and I can try to integrate those answers into part 2. So here's save the date for the next training. We're going to be focusing on protection orders and public benefits, and an overview of all the different forms of immigration relief as they relate to the public benefits and protection orders as well, and immigration relief for victims on the 24th. 2 slides, please, forward. And so the new app has a resource library and a toolkit for police and prosecutors and materials here. There's also a link to specific materials for this training that we provided you. Next slide, please. This is what our resource library looks like. And there's all different kinds of topics that you can look up information on. And Shelley.
Yeah, so just know that we have some virtual roundtables coming up. This is a great opportunity for question answer, working with individuals who kind of, I mean, Bob and I focus on U visas, so I feel like we can be a good resource for you guys. So just know that those are available, and all that information is going to be sent out to you guys on the upcoming roundtables. And next slide, we have on-site training, obviously, as well as virtual. And we would love to come out and help train not only you, but anybody else in your community that you think could benefit from this. Anywhere from U visas, T visas, language access. I mean, we kind of run the gamut. We're about victims, and the victim-based approach is so important to new apps. So please reach out to us. You've got our information there. And I will let Leslie wrap it up, but thank you very much for letting us have some of your time today. I appreciate it, and reach out to me if you need me.
Yeah, and you can reach, we can connect you with either Shelley or Bob or any of our other law enforcement or prosecutor faculty. If you have questions, we connect prosecutors with prosecutors, law enforcement with law enforcement. We even have judges that, for those, I know there were a couple of people on the webinar who work at courts or judges, and we have judges who, judicial faculty who answer technical assistance as well. This is how you contact us for technical assistance, and this is how, if you're a prosecutor, you contact Equitas. So I welcome you to join the next webinar, and for those of you that are law enforcement prosecutors or victims witness staff in law enforcement or prosecutors agencies, I really encourage you to think about joining our roundtables, where you can have we have discussions among law enforcement officials and staff at their agencies about these important issues. So thank you all for the great work you're doing for victims. We're here to support you in that effort, and thank you for joining us today, and have a good week.
Thank you, guys.